Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Nintendo Switch 2, and specifically regarding how successful I think it'll be, especially given certain factors. So let's just get into it. So of course, the question we're posing in this video, how successful will Nintendo Switch 2 actually be? It will depend on certain factors. We know from investor interviews that Nintendo is taking a more cautious approach to their generational transition this time around, especially considering their history. And of course, regarding Nintendo's history on this matter, we know what happened with the Wii U, we know how successful the Wii was, and so we can look back at their history and kind of determine, or at least estimate, how successful this next generation Nintendo system will be given the past. So of course, like I mentioned, Nintendo is in fact handling this generational transition from the Switch to the successor console in a more cautious way compared to before. And of course, the handling of a generational transition includes aspects such as marketing, the launch price, as well as the game lineup. And we're not just talking about the initial launch lineup, we're talking about the launch window lineup. In other words, games that are launching within the first year or so of a console's launch. And of course, there's also another aspect, and that is power. But of course, that's for another video entirely. Does power really matter in this case? But to sum up what I really feel about this topic, I would say not really. I do not think that power matters nearly as much as some people think, although I do think to some extent it does. But Nintendo has always been in a favorable position in this regard. Unlike Sony and Microsoft, who compete for the latest and greatest in technology and power, as well as their fans expecting big leaps each generation, Nintendo has comfortably carved its own path and doesn't really need to rely on advanced technology, and Nintendo fans don't really expect that to be the case anyways. So, to get started, let's look at a brief history of Nintendo consoles and their varying degrees of success. Now, Nintendo consoles were basically on a steady decline even before the Wii came out. However, their handhelds have always remained fairly strong, no matter what generation. I mean, sure, the 3DS was less successful than previous handhelds, but was still able to sell over 75 million units, which was still a great result. To understand what could go wrong with the Nintendo Switch 2, or whatever the Nintendo's next generation system will be called, it's important to look at one of Nintendo's biggest failures, which was, of course, the Wii U. When we look at the Wii U, we see that there was a lot of issues when it came to the marketing of the system. The price point of the system was also the highest of any Nintendo system prior to that. And of course, the game lineup, the launch lineup, but even just the trickle of content that came out even after that was fairly thin. We had a thin launch lineup, and we also had an overall thin launch window lineup for the Wii U. And like I mentioned in my previous video, the Wii U was fairly dry in terms of content even throughout its lifespan. So of course the biggest offender was, in many people's eyes, was the marketing of the Wii U. It wasn't enough that the naming alone, the Wii U, was fairly confusing to people, considering people thought that it was just an attachment or an add-on to the existing Wii, not actually a full next generation console. It also suffered from bad advertising. So when we look at the commercials of the Wii U, it was mainly catering to an audience that no longer really cared about the Wii, or the casual audience in general. And when we look at the game lineup, when we look at the launch lineup, we can see that New Super Mario Bros. Was basically the headlining game for the system, New Super Mario Bros. U. And while that was a fantastic game in its own right, I am one of those people who actually think that it is in fact the best New Super Mario Bros. Game to date. It also came out the same year as another New Super Mario Bros. Game that came out on the 3DS, New Super Mario Bros. 2. So we were basically already at a point where it was just too much of the same thing. And even then, a game like that wasn't really going to be enough for people to buy a brand new console. Now, let's look at the opposite result. The Nintendo Switch launched to massive success, and it continues to be a success to this day, which is one of the reasons why we haven't actually seen a next-gen system just yet. We see that the Switch launched with a fairly thin launch lineup as well, so this is something similar to the Wii U. However, There was one key difference in that launch lineup, and that was a big, heavy hitter, AAA, critically acclaimed game, and that was, of course, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. This game may have just changed the game when it came to the Nintendo Switch, or at least the launch of the Nintendo Switch. It was revolutionary, it was fantastic, it was a game that sold the system. And if we look at the marketing is probably one of the best pieces of marketing and advertisement Nintendo has done for any of their systems to date. Even just from the first trailer alone of the Switch, it conveyed exactly what it was, what it needed to be, what people could expect from it in terms of features, in terms of what it could do, and even showcased some games like Skyrim and Splatoon 2 for the first time, and of course Super Mario Odyssey for the first time. It was, for all intents and purposes, a great trailer, a great first look at their next-gen system. And even after that, the advertising continued to still be really good. And of course, we can talk about the naming as well, the Nintendo Switch, which was perfect because it conveyed exactly what it was. It was different enough from the previous system. It's not like they called it the Nintendo Wii U 2. They called it the Nintendo Switch, something completely different, and the Switch name conveys exactly what it does. It switches between TV and handheld modes. Now, I've seen this mentioned in many comment sections in many videos, and it's 100% true, right? Nintendo sequel systems, and I'll elaborate exactly what I mean by sequel systems, but Nintendo's sequel systems tend to perform significantly less than their previous iterations. So for example, the Super Nintendo is a sequel system because it is basically the Nintendo Entertainment System branding and advertising and everything else, but with the word super in front of it, implying that it is significantly more powerful and better. But would it surprise you to know that it sold less than the first one? The Super Nintendo Entertainment System sold roughly 49 or around 50 million units worldwide, whereas the Nintendo Entertainment System sold around more than 60 million units worldwide. So it performed not that much worse, but it still sold less than the previous iteration. Now, if we look at another sequel system, the Nintendo 3DS, which actually sold pretty well, like I mentioned earlier, it sold about 75 million units globally during its lifespan. Overall, a success. But for Nintendo handheld standards, it actually performed not too well compared to other Nintendo handhelds. When we look at the Nintendo DS, the predecessor to the 3DS, that sold over 150 million units. It's the second highest selling console of all time, just behind the PlayStation 2, and only by a small margin. Now, if we look at the 3DS, it is a significant drop. It is a sequel system, so it retains a lot of the same branding, a lot of the same type of advertising as the Nintendo DS, a lot of the same type of features like the dual screen, but with added 3D, and it sold significantly less. So Nintendo's generational transition for this console, at the end of the day, while it performed okay, it was still hard to transition from the DS to the 3DS. And of course, Nintendo had their own fair share of problems with this as well, like pricing the 3DS too high, and they had to resort to a price drop a few months later to $169. It was rough. It was a rough first year for the 3DS. But we can see, even with beloved sequel systems like the Game Boy Advance, it still sold less than the original Game Boy. Even though I love the Game Boy Advance, and it was still a success, it still sold less. And of course, the worst offender is of course the Wii U, but we already mentioned that. And then now we come up to Nintendo's next generation system, the Nintendo Switch 2, which has yet to be announced. But if the rumors and reports are true, this is a system that is poised to be very similar to the regular Switch. It is going to be a hybrid system that can be taken on the go and be put onto your TV. So for all intents and purposes, it will be a more powerful Switch in concept. Nintendo may change the branding, they may name it something entirely different, but at the end of the day, it is still a Switch in its concept. So it's a sequel system, essentially. And if Nintendo wanted to name it, let's say Nintendo Switch 2, or Super Nintendo Switch, like many people are suggesting, which I do like as well, then that further solidifies the fact that yes, it is a sequel system. It is a system that is taking the same aspects, the same features, the same rough branding of the previous system and applying it to the next gen. So by that alone, and by Nintendo's track record alone of sequel systems, we can assume that it's not going to sell as many systems as the regular Switch. I feel like that's very likely. Is it possible that it could still outsell the regular Switch? Of course. Look at the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 completely outsold the PlayStation 1. But for Nintendo in particular, sequel consoles have always had less sales. And so in that regard, it's safe to assume that this next system will follow suit in that regard. But will it be a failure? In my opinion, I do not think that this next system is going to be a failure in any way, shape, or form. I think Nintendo has firmly learned from previous lessons and is doing the best they can to have a smooth generational transition this time around, especially considering the fact that they want to merge Nintendo accounts, they want to have them move forward. Clearly, Nintendo is very keen on players being able to transition as smoothly as they can to the next generation of Nintendo. Will we see backwards compatibility? It's possible. There are reports suggesting that that is a strong likelihood, and that's going to be a really good thing for Nintendo's generational transition. Now, in my opinion, I think it is very, very unlikely we'll see a failure as bad as the Wii U. I do not think that this next system will suffer that same fate. Now, that being said, I'm actually someone who likes the Wii U. I like the concept, and I think it was very, very promising, but there were a lot of issues that came with that launch and with that console and with everything, like its marketing, its game lineup. There were a lot of issues, but I think that the core idea of that console was really cool. So, before I end the video, I do want to give my own little prediction as to how successful I think this system will be. I want to give like a rough estimate, a rough range in terms of sales numbers, given the history of Nintendo and the fact that I do believe they've learned from a lot of their mistakes. But this next system might still be subject to the fact that sequel consoles from Nintendo tend to sell less than their predecessors. So I want to take all of this into account, right? So, do I think it's going to sell 140 plus million? Because at this point, the Nintendo Switch, as I'm recording this video, has sold roughly 139, basically 140 million units worldwide. That's insane. That is the third highest selling console ever. That's crazy. Do I think the Nintendo Switch 2, or whatever Nintendo's next-gen system will be called, do I think it'll outsell the Switch? I don't believe it will. I personally think there's a higher chance it might sell better if the branding had nothing to do with the Switch. If it had a completely new branding scheme and everything was different, including the name. Let's say the name didn't have the word Switch in it. Then I think this might be an unpopular opinion, but I do think that if they completely rebranded it, and had nothing to do with the word Switch, even the Switch logo wasn't used, the click sound for the logo wasn't used, like let's say they changed everything, I think it would actually sell better because it signifies that it's a completely new thing, new generation for Nintendo. But if they market it as a sequel console to the Switch, so let's say they called it the Nintendo Switch 2 or the Super Nintendo Switch, it's going to sell great in my opinion, but I don't think it's going to sell as much simply because history shows that that just has not been the case for Nintendo. But despite me saying that, once again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. I do believe Nintendo has learned from many lessons from the past, and I think they are prepping this launch to be one of the best launches they can have for a new console. So with that being said, while I do believe that Nintendo Switch 2 will not sell as much as the regular Switch, I do think it'll be a success. I do think it'll be a big success, and I do firmly believe it will sell roughly 100 million units or more. That's my own solid prediction at the end of the day, and you can refer back to this video when it's all said and done in a few years from now, and we can all compare. But anyways, guys, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Those are just my brief thoughts on the matter. And so with that being said, I will see you in the next video. Take care, guys. Have a good one. Bye-bye.